Welcome to Transformation Fridays. This is Chani. We're going to talk about the ego today and the ego in relationship to the soul. How do we differentiate the two? How do we know which one is showing up and why it matters? So the ego is something that I think there's a lot of narrative around needing to fight against it, right? Needing to fight against this part of ourselves that shows up and is destructive or is defensive, or right, we talk about ego, somebody having a really big ego, they're full of themselves, like all of these sort of narratives. And I want to get a little bit more granular in the way that we're talking about what the ego is and how we identify it so that we can really work with it. And on the other end of the spectrum of that, what is the soul and how are we identifying the presence of that so that when either one of these are at play, because they're not necessarily going to be able to occupy the same space at the same time, so whichever is at play, we can be clear within ourselves of who's talking and what aspect of ourselves is showing up so that we can start to make adjustments where we feel it would be appropriate for our lives, right? So the ego is always going to be a judge. The ego is always going to be a protector. The ego is always going to be the one that steps forward with a story about your identity and says, I'm going to protect you, right? And so it's protecting the you that it's saying, nope, you stand back. I've got this, right? You're not going to get hurt anymore. You're not going to be afraid anymore. You're not going to feel rejected anymore. And so the ego comes forward and starts to tell the stories. And it's telling the stories of the identities that have come up within your experience to create the personality, right? So the personality now has all these different facets and all of these different sort of pockets of narratives and stories that it's carrying around with it. Oh, people, you can't trust people, or all men suck, or, women aren't trustworthy, or whatever the fuck the ego is saying, and the stories that you have come up with throughout your life that the ego is now carrying in a bag, ready to pull them out at a moment's notice. You have an interaction and you start to feel a way, and the ego's like, you're not going to feel that way. I got this. And the ego comes forward because the ego's already carrying the story of why that feeling is coming up in you in the first place, right? And so the ego steps up to the plate. And yeah, the ego is full of itself, and the ego does get defensive, and the ego is really wanting to make sure that it is in control. The soul, on the other hand, is a whisperer. The soul is something that you have to perk your ears to, right? Whereas the ego is so loud, excuse me, like you got to cover your ears to even get away from the vocal projection, right, that the ego is putting forward. The soul is a whisperer. So you've got to listen for the soul. You've got to be quiet for the soul. You've got to be present for the soul. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these etymologies. And so in your life, right, I'm going to talk about that in a sec. I just want to say this. In your life, if you are being presented with somebody, or you yourself are presenting as defensive, as angry, as depressed, as sad, as anxious, as any of these emotions that take you out of being able to be present and being able to feel as though you deserve peace in a moment and that you can access it yourself, that's ego. The reason I don't want us to kill the ego, and I want to really do away with that whole narrative of like, let's kill the ego, is that the ego is made up of the stories that have created who you are. And so if you kill the ego, you're killing an aspect of yourself. And now whatever you've got left, once you kill the ego, is the part of you that thought that that other part of you wasn't even good enough to come along for the ride. And who is that? Is that not also a part of the ego? So now the ego is in this battle with itself, right? So let's not kill the ego. Let's instead think of the ego as a child. Let's think of every aspect of ourselves that's showing up, that's saying, hey, I'm going to protect you. Hey, no, I got this, right? I'm going to be defensive. I'm going to be your protector. Let's think of that aspect of ourselves as a child and listen to what the fuck they have to say, right? So the soul, when you're able to come to peace, when you're able to come to center, when you're able to understand what it is that's happening around you as a reflection of an aspect of yourself that's requiring to be shifted in order for you to advance, this is when you know that the soul is present. This is when you know that your soul is the one that's in the driver's seat. And that's where we want to get to. Ultimately, we want the soul in the driver's seat. So this is my message for you today. I could go on about this. I hope that it's helpful. I hope that you guys get something from this. Your ego is not your enemy. Your ego is a beautiful reflection of the stories that you have created throughout your life to protect you. Oh, the etymologies, I didn't give them to you. So the etymology of ego is I, right? And this makes sense, right? Because everything that you are, the etymology of the soul, everything that you are, the soul is consciousness. The soul is the actuating cause, right? So the ego is the I, and so you are being asked to, by the ego, to funnel all of your essence, all of your infiniteness through the I. So the ego is the I, the soul is the I am, and they're very different. They're very different. The I am recognizes, the I judges. Enjoy your day. See y'all next week.